first, it was comforting. The birdsong threaded through the trees like a living thing, a constant presence as Mara and Colin walked the trail that looped the lake. The late afternoon light filtered through the branches in thin, dusty beams, catching on drifting pollen and the occasional falling leaf. Every step stirred the forest floor, dry twigs snapping softly, the loam releasing a damp, mineral scent. Somewhere overhead, something fluttered and chirped, sharp and quick, then vanished into the canopy. Mara breathed in deeply, letting the sound wash over her. "This place feels untouched," she said, "like it doesn't know about us yet." The birds stopped, not gradually, not fading with distance. They cut off mid-note, as if a switch had been thrown. One moment the air was full of sound. The next, it was hollow. The silence felt thick, heavy enough to press against her ears. Colin slowed. "That's weird." As soon as he spoke, the birds remained silent. No rustle of wings, no tentative chirp, only the faint hiss of wind threading through the branches above them. Mara frowned. "They'll start up again." They stood there, waiting. A minute passed, then two. The forest felt paused. Caught in an inhale it refused to release. Finally, somewhere behind them, a single bird let out a cautious note. Then another. The chorus rebuilt itself slowly, sound returning in careful layers. Mara laughed, a little too loud. "See? Just coincidence." They continued walking. The trail narrowed as it curved along the lakeshore. The water lay dark and still, reflecting the sky in fractured pieces between reeds. Long shadows stretched across the path, pulled thin by the sinking sun. The air had cooled, and Mara tugged her jacket tighter. After a while, Colin spoke again. "Do you remember if this trail always felt this long?" The birds stopped. Again, immediate, absolute. Mara felt a chill creep up her spine. The silence after his voice felt sharper this time, as though it had edges. Even the wind seemed to falter, leaves hanging motionless on their stems. They didn't look at each other. "Okay," Mara said carefully. The word barely left her mouth before the forest went dead silent once more, as if her voice itself were the trigger. Her heart began to beat faster. Colin swallowed. "That's not funny." The birds remained quiet. Somewhere far off, something shifted, a branch settling or something heavier moving through undergrowth. The sound echoed too clearly, unmasked by the usual noise of the forest. Mara lowered her voice, as though volume might matter. "Maybe it's predators. We talk, they hide." The logic sounded thin even to her. They waited again. The silence stretched, elastic and uncomfortable, until at last the birds cautiously returned. But they didn't sound the same. The calls were spaced farther apart, uncertain, as if the forest were testing something. They walked on without speaking. Each footstep felt too loud. The trail markers looked unfamiliar, though Mara knew they hadn't strayed. The light dimmed faster than it should have, shadows pooling at the bases of trees, blurring their roots into black tangles. Eventually, Colin couldn't help himself. "Mara!" The birds fell silent. Not just silent, gone. The air itself seemed to absorb sound, swallowing even the soft rush of blood in her ears. Mara stopped walking. Her mouth had gone dry. Colin's breathing sounded harsh now, the only noise left. He lowered his voice to a whisper. It's like they're listening for something else once we talk." Mara shook her head, though he couldn't see it well in the gloom. "That's ridiculous." The forest disagreed. The silence deepened, stretching outward, as if it had distance, as if it could grow. Mara became acutely aware of how exposed they were. The narrow trail, the cold air slipping beneath her collar, the lake on one side and dense trees on the other. No houses, no traffic, no voices but their own. She tried to remember when the birds had first gone quiet. Had it really been only when they spoke? Or had it started earlier, creeping in so gradually that her mind had filled in the gaps? Colin whispered, "What if it's not the sound they care about?" Her pulse thudded in her ears. What if it's acknowledgement? The word lingered in the air like a held breath. The birds did not return this time. Something moved beyond the tree line. Not fast, not loud, just a subtle displacement, branches bending where nothing visible passed through them. Shadows slid where they shouldn't have. Mara fought the urge to run. She had the sudden, overwhelming sense that movement might be interpreted as a response. "We shouldn't talk anymore," she whispered. The silence sharpened, as though offended. They stood there, frozen, as the last scraps of daylight drained from the sky. The forest felt closer now, its boundaries tightening. Even the lake seemed to recede, its surface dull and lightless. Minutes passed, or hours. Mara couldn't tell. Time felt distorted, measured only by the tension in her muscles and the ache in her jaw from holding it clenched. At last, a bird chirped. It was close, much closer than before. The sound came from just behind them. Mara's breath hitched. Then another chirp, and another. But the calls were wrong, too slow, too deliberate, each note placed with careful intent. The rhythm matched something else now, the pace of her heartbeat. Colin leaned toward her, lips barely moving. "They're not warning each other anymore." Mara closed her eyes. The chirping stopped again. Not because either of them spoke. It stopped as if it had finished saying what it needed to say. In the silence that followed, Mara understood with sick clarity. The birds weren't reacting to their voices. They were making room for something else to listen. And whatever it was, it didn't need sound to know they were there. Behind them, a branch creaked under weight. Mara opened her mouth to scream, and the forest fell perfectly, obediently silent. The forest felt older than memory. Not ancient in the way history books described, no dates, no eras, but older in the sense that it did not care whether it was remembered at all. Rowan sensed it the moment they passed beneath the bowed trees and the fog swallowed the trail behind them. The air cooled abruptly, heavy with moisture and rot. Each breath carried the scent of damp bark, decaying leaves, and something faintly sour beneath it, like iron left too long in water. The trunks rose thick and dark, their surfaces layered with moss that clung in soft, velvety sheets. The green looked healthy at first, lush, thriving, but there was an unevenness to it that tugged at Rowan's attention. Some patches grew thicker than others, forming ridges and gaps that felt intentional in a way growth shouldn't. Beside him, Lark slowed her pace. "This isn't right," she murmured. Rowan glanced at the compass in his palm. The needle wavered, then stilled, then wavered again. He turned in a slow circle. The forest seemed to lean with him, branches creaking softly as though adjusting their posture. "It's just fog," he said, though the words felt thin. "Everything looks wrong in fog." Lark didn't answer. She had stopped in front of a massive oak whose bark was deeply furrowed, the grooves filled with thick moss. She raised a hand but didn't touch it. "Look," she said. Rowan followed her gaze. The moss formed a pattern, not carved, not disturbed, simply grown more densely in certain lines. 3 shapes, uneven and soft-edged, but unmistakable once noticed. "Oh!" The final shape blurred, dissolving back into green when Rowan blinked. His throat tightened. "That's nothing." Lark didn't look away. "You saw it too." They stood there longer than necessary, the forest pressing close in the silence. No birds called. No insects hummed. The quiet wasn't absence. It felt occupied, like a held breath. When they resumed walking, the path narrowed. Roots twisted underfoot, slick with moisture. Rowan stumbled once and realized he couldn't remember the last 10 steps he'd taken. Only that the forest felt closer now, trunks angling inward, shadows thickening where light should have reached. They came upon another tree. This time, the moss formed more shapes. Fragmented, incomplete. Rowan's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, heart hammering, and the shapes softened, their edges sagging into randomness. He stepped back. They reappeared. Lark's voice shook. "It changes when you look directly at it." Rowan swallowed. "It's pareidolia," the brain filling gaps. The words sounded rehearsed, protective. As they moved deeper, the forest began to behave strangely. Paths looped without turning. Reflections in shallow puddles lagged a fraction of a second behind their movements. Rowan caught himself staring at his mirrored face too long, unsettled by how unfamiliar it felt. Memory slipped. He lost track of conversations mid-sentence. Once, he turned to ask Lark a question and couldn't remember her name for a terrifying heartbeat. The forest seemed to hum faintly then, low and distant, like something satisfied. The moss words grew bolder. Lark, half her name, spelled unevenly across the bark of a cedar. She backed away from it, breath ragged. I never told you my full name. Rowan stared at the letters, dread pooling in his stomach. You didn't have to. The fog thickened, blurring distance until every tree looked the same. The forest leaned closer, branches knitting overhead, blocking what little light remained. The air grew colder, sharper, pressing against their lungs. Another word appeared. Rowan flinched. The moss shifted subtly when he looked away, lines thickening, filling gaps. Rowan. He felt something inside him loosen, as though a piece of himself had been lifted and examined. Don't read them, Lark whispered. I think it finishes them when we do. They tried to leave. The path behind them no longer existed. Where it should have been, the forest stood dense and impassable. Trees crowded together, their trunks close enough to touch. Moss climbed them in heavy sheets, forming new shapes. Stay. Rowan felt a sudden certainty that the word had always been there. Or maybe he had always been meant to read it. His thoughts grew slippery. Memories blurred at the edges. Faces without names, places without context. He knew he was afraid, but the reason felt distant, abstract. Lark pressed a hand to her temple. I can't remember how long we've been walking. Rowan opened his mouth to answer and stopped. The moss nearby rearranged itself, thickening, smoothing. Long N. The word waited. Rowan felt an impulse. Not external, not forced, but internal, like a thought completing itself. Oof, he whispered. The moss surged, completing the phrase. Long enough. The forest seemed to relax. Something fundamental shifted then. Rowan felt it inside his chest, a quiet rearranging. The fear dulled. The urgency softened. The forest no longer felt hostile. Felt familiar, comforting. Lark stared at him, eyes wide. Rowan, what did you do? He tried to answer but found the words unnecessary. The forest already knew. The moss climbed higher, spelling new fragments, weaving names and memories together, rewriting edges of thought. Lark took a step back, then another, but the trees leaned inward, roots rising to meet her feet. Rowan watched calmly as the moss began forming her name again. Not as a warning, as a correction. The fog closed in, and the forest continued its quiet work, patient and precise, erasing what no longer fit and keeping what it needed. After all, names were just a beginning.